When Rachel Thompson hit record on her laptop at 2:47 a.m., broadcasting from her cramped apartment kitchen, she never imagined that within 24 hours, federal agents would be pounding on her door. What started as one nurse's attempt to expose the truth about Mercy General Hospital would become the story that shook an entire town and proved that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is simply tell the truth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The amber glow of streetlights filtered through the thin curtains of Rachel Thompson's second-floor apartment, casting long shadows across the cluttered kitchen table where she sat hunched over her laptop. The clock on the microwave blinked 2:47 a.m. in harsh red digits, but sleep was the furthest thing from her mind. Steam rose from the mug of black coffee beside her, the third cup since midnight, and her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the cheap USB microphone she'd ordered online just 2 weeks ago. Rachel had never considered herself brave. At 32, she was the kind of person who preferred the background, the quiet efficiency of working double shifts at Mercy General Hospital without complaint, the steady rhythm of checking vitals, and administering medications while the rest of Cedar Falls slept. Her brown hair was always pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her scrubs were always clean but never fashionable, and her voice rarely rose above a whisper during staff meetings. She was invisible in the way that dedicated nurses often are, essential but overlooked, trusted but undervalued. But tonight was different. Tonight, the weight of what she had witnessed over the past 6 months had finally become too heavy to carry alone. The manila folder beside her laptop contained photocopies of documents that would change everything, evidence of a corruption so deep and systematic that it had taken her weeks to fully comprehend its scope. Patient billing records showing charges for procedures never performed, insurance claims for equipment that existed only on paper, staffing reports that listed nurses who had quit months ago, still working full shifts, their paychecks mysteriously deposited into accounts controlled by hospital administration. The apartment around her reflected a life lived paycheck to paycheck despite her years of education and dedication. The furniture was second-hand, sturdy but worn. Medical textbooks were stacked on every available surface, their pages dog-eared from constant reference. A small potted plant on the windowsill was the only splash of color in the otherwise beige and brown space. The walls were thin enough that she could hear Mrs. Chen upstairs, shuffling around in her slippers, probably unable to sleep again since her husband's recent surgery at Mercy General, a surgery that had somehow cost their family twice what they had been quoted. Rachel's fingers hovered over the keyboard as she prepared to launch her podcast, Night Shift Truths. The name had come to her during one of those endless overnight shifts when she'd found herself alone in the break room, staring at billing, statements that made no sense, watching Dr. Marcus Hoffman's Mercedes pull into the executive parking space at 3 a.m. for what he claimed was an emergency consultation, but which she knew was actually a meeting with insurance representatives about maximizing claim payouts. The decision to start the podcast hadn't been sudden. It had grown slowly, like a persistent ache that gradually becomes unbearable. It started with small inconsistencies she noticed while working her shifts, patients being charged for private rooms when they were clearly in shared spaces, medication costs that seemed to double overnight without explanation, equipment rental fees for machines that the hospital had owned for years. At first, she'd assumed these were clerical errors, the kind of administrative mistakes that plague any large institution. But then she'd started paying closer attention. She'd begun documenting what she saw, writing down details in a small notebook she kept in her locker. She'd started asking questions, carefully and quietly, of other nurses during shift changes. What she discovered was a web of financial manipulation that went far beyond simple billing errors. This was systematic fraud, orchestrated from the top levels of hospital administration and designed to extract maximum profit from patients and insurance companies while providing minimal actual care. The breaking point had come 3 weeks ago, when she'd been assigned to care for an elderly man named Walter Kowalski, a retired factory worker whose wife had died the previous year. Walter had been admitted for what should have been a routine gallbladder surgery, but his recovery had been complicated by what the medical charts described as unexpected complications requiring extended care. Rachel had cared for Walter during his extended stay, watching him grow weaker and more confused as days stretched into weeks. It wasn't until she'd accidentally seen his billing statement left on a printer in the administrative office where she'd gone to file some paperwork that she'd understood what was happening. Walter was being kept in the hospital not because his medical condition required it, but because his insurance coverage allowed for extended stays that could be billed at premium rates. The procedures listed on his statement included surgeries that had never been performed, consultations with specialists who had never seen him, and medications that had never been administered. When Walter had finally been discharged, confused and financially devastated, Rachel had made her decision. She couldn't remain silent any longer. The system that she had dedicated her career to serving was systematically destroying the lives of the people she had sworn to protect. The Hippocratic oath she had taken as a nurse included the promise to first do no harm, but by staying silent, she was becoming complicit in harm being done on a massive scale. Setting up the podcast had been easier than she'd expected. Technology that would have been prohibitively expensive just a few years ago was now accessible to anyone with a laptop and an internet connection. She'd spent her savings on basic recording equipment and had taught herself audio editing through YouTube tutorials during her rare free hours. The hardest part hadn't been the technical aspects. It had been finding the courage to speak. Rachel had always been more comfortable listening than talking, more inclined to observe than to act. But as she sat in her kitchen that night, surrounded by evidence of corruption that affected every patient who walked through the doors of Mercy General, she realized that comfort was a luxury she could no longer afford. The people of Cedar Falls trusted their local hospital to care for them in their most vulnerable moments. That trust was being violated every single day, and she was the only person in a position to expose it. The folder beside her contained months of careful documentation. She had photocopied billing records during quiet moments between patient rounds. She had written down conversations she had overheard in administrative offices. She had collected testimonies from other nurses who had noticed the same disturbing patterns but had been too afraid to speak up. Some had been threatened with termination when they had raised questions. Others had been transferred to less desirable shifts or departments when they had shown too much curiosity about billing practices. Lisa Martinez, her closest friend among the nursing staff, had been the only person Rachel had confided in about her discoveries. Lisa worked in the cardiac unit and had noticed similar billing irregularities in her department. Together, they had pieced together a picture of corruption that extended throughout the hospital. But when Rachel had suggested going to the authorities, Lisa had reminded her of what had happened to Jennifer Walsh, a nurse who had tried to blow the whistle on safety violations the previous year. Jennifer had been fired on trumped-up charges and had been unable to find work at any other medical facility in the region. The medical community was small and tightly connected, and those who caused trouble found themselves effectively blacklisted. The podcast format had appealed to Rachel because it allowed her to present the information systematically and reach a wide audience without going through traditional media channels that might be influenced by the hospital's significant advertising, budget and political connections. Cedar Falls was a small enough town that Mercy General was one of the largest employers, and Dr. Hoffman served on the boards of several local organizations. Going through official channels would likely result in the evidence being suppressed and her own career being destroyed before any meaningful change could occur. As she prepared to record her first episode, Rachel thought about the patients whose stories she would be sharing. She had changed their names and identifying details to protect their privacy, but their suffering was real and documented. There was Maria Santos, a single mother who had been charged for a cesarean section that had never been performed when she had given birth naturally. There was Robert Chen, an elderly man whose routine blood work had somehow generated bills for complex cardiac procedures he had never received. There was Susan Bradley, a teacher whose simple broken arm had resulted in charges for orthopedic surgery and weeks of physical therapy that had never taken place. Each of these cases represented not just financial fraud, but a profound violation of trust. These were people who had come to the hospital in their time of greatest need, looking for healing and care, and had instead been treated as sources of revenue to be maximized regardless of their actual medical needs. The emotional toll on the patients and their families was devastating, but it was the systematic nature of the fraud that made it truly horrifying. Rachel's investigation had revealed that the corruption wasn't limited to billing fraud. Staffing levels were deliberately kept below safe minimums to maximize profits, with nurses regularly forced to care for more patients than recommended guidelines suggested was safe. Equipment maintenance was deferred beyond safe limits to avoid costs, putting patients at risk. Medications were sometimes substituted with cheaper alternatives without patient consent or knowledge. The entire operation was designed to extract maximum profit while providing minimal actual care. The weight of this knowledge had been crushing her for months. She had found herself lying awake at night, thinking about patients she had cared for who might have received inadequate treatment because of cost-cutting measures. She had started questioning every aspect of her work, wondering how many of the procedures and treatments she had administered had been motivated by genuine medical necessity versus financial opportunity. Starting the podcast felt like the only way to lift this burden, to transform her knowledge into action that might actually help the people being harmed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She had spent weeks preparing her first episode, carefully organizing the evidence and planning how to present it in a way that would be both compelling and legally defensible. She had consulted with a lawyer anonymously about whistleblower protections, and had been disappointed to learn that healthcare workers had fewer legal protections than she had hoped. The name Night Shift Truths reflected both the literal time when she would be recording during the quiet hours when she was off duty and the metaphorical darkness that she was trying to illuminate. The night shift at the hospital had always been when she felt most connected to the real purpose of healthcare, when the administrative layers fell away and it was just her and the patients who needed care. It was during those quiet midnight hours that she had first noticed the discrepancies that had led to her investigation, and it seemed fitting that those same hours would be when she finally found the courage to speak out. As the clock approached 3 a.m., Rachel took a deep breath and clicked the record button. The red light on her microphone seemed to pulse with her heartbeat as she leaned forward and began to speak, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to set in motion. Good morning, Cedar Falls. My name is Rachel Thompson, and I'm a registered nurse at Mercy General Hospital. What I'm about to tell you might be hard to believe, but every word is true, and I have the documents to prove it. For the past 6 months, I've been uncovering evidence of systematic fraud and corruption at our local hospital. Fraud that has been stealing money from patients and insurance companies while putting lives at risk. Tonight, I'm going to share that evidence with You because the people of this town deserve to know what's really happening behind the doors of the institution they trust with their lives. The first episode of Night Shift Truths went live at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in October, uploaded to a free podcast hosting platform that Rachel had chosen specifically because it required minimal personal information. She had expected maybe a dozen downloads from curious co-workers who might stumble across it, perhaps a few family members who would listen out of politeness. What she hadn't anticipated was the avalanche that would follow. By noon that same day, the episode had been downloaded over 500 times. By evening, that number had climbed to 3,000. Rachel discovered this while checking her phone during her dinner break at the hospital, nearly choking on her sandwich when she saw the analytics dashboard. Comments were pouring in faster than she could read them, and her anonymous email account was flooding with messages from people sharing their own experiences with Mercy General's billing practices. The response wasn't universally positive. Mixed. Among the supportive messages were angry accusations that she was a disgruntled employee trying to damage the hospital's reputation. Several comments questioned her qualifications and suggested she was motivated by jealousy or personal grievances, rather than genuine concern for patients. But for every negative response, there were 5 messages of support from people who had experienced exactly the kind of billing irregularities she had described. One message particularly struck her. It came from Margaret Foster, an elderly woman whose husband had been treated at Mercy General the previous winter. "My Harold passed away 3 months after his treatment," Margaret had written. "The bills kept coming for weeks afterward, charging us for procedures I know he never had because I was with him every day. I thought I was going crazy, but your podcast makes me realize I wasn't imagining things. Thank you for having the courage to speak up." Rachel read Margaret's message while sitting in her car in the hospital parking lot, tears streaming down her face as she realized the true scope of what she had uncovered. This wasn't just about money. It was about families being financially devastated during the most vulnerable periods of their lives, about trust being violated when people needed it most. But the positive response also meant increased scrutiny. By Wednesday morning, Dr. Marcus Hoffman had called an emergency staff meeting. Rachel sat in the back of the conference room, her hands folded in her lap, as Hoffman addressed the assembled nurses and support staff with barely contained fury. His usually pristine appearance showed signs of strain. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his silver hair was disheveled, and dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept much the previous night. "It has come to my attention," Hoffman began, his voice tight with controlled anger, "that someone on our staff has been spreading malicious rumors about this hospital through social media channels. I want to make it absolutely clear that any employee found to be disparaging Mercy General or sharing confidential patient information will face immediate termination and potential legal action." The room was silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Rachel could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral, her eyes focused on her hands. She had been careful not to use any patient names or identifying information in her podcast, and everything she had shared was based on her own observations and publicly available billing records. Still, the threat was clear. Hoffman continued, his speech outlining new policies regarding social media use and information sharing. All staff members would be required to sign updated confidentiality agreements, and any employee found to be in violation would face severe consequences. Security cameras would be installed in common areas, and access to administrative offices would be more strictly controlled. After the meeting, Rachel found herself walking through the hospital corridors with a new awareness of being watched. Tom Bradley, the hospital's security chief, seemed to appear wherever she went, his presence more noticeable than it had ever been before. During her rounds, she noticed administrators she had never seen before observing the nursing stations, taking notes on clipboards and speaking in hushed tones. The pressure was building, but so was the support. Her second podcast episode, released Thursday night, attracted even more attention than the first. This time, she focused specifically on staffing issues, documenting how the hospital consistently operated below safe nurse-to-patient ratios while billing insurance companies for care that met proper staffing standards. She shared anonymized stories of near-miss incidents that had occurred due to inadequate staffing, moments when patients could have been seriously harmed if not for the heroic efforts of overworked nurses. Lisa Martinez cornered her during Friday's shift change, pulling her into an empty supply closet where they could speak privately. "Rachel, you need to be careful," Lisa whispered, her eyes wide with concern. "Word is getting around about who might be behind the podcast. Hoffman's been asking questions and Bradley's been reviewing security footage from the administrative areas." Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. What kind of questions? "He's been asking about which nurses have access to billing records, who's been working extra shifts that would give them time in the administrative areas. He specifically asked about you yesterday, wanted to know about your work history and whether you'd ever had disciplinary issues." The weight of what she had started was beginning to settle on Rachel's shoulders like a heavy blanket. She had, and known there would be consequences, but the reality of those consequences was more immediate and personal than she had imagined. Still, when she thought about Margaret Foster's message and the dozens of similar stories that continued to pour into her email inbox, she knew she couldn't stop now. That weekend, Rachel spent hours preparing her third episode, this one focusing on the financial impact of the hospital's practices on individual families. She had received permission from several listeners to share their stories in more detail, and the picture that emerged was devastating. Families driven into bankruptcy by fraudulent medical bills. Elderly patients choosing between medication and food because of unexpected charges. Young parents taking on crushing debt for procedures their children had never received. But as she prepared to upload the episode Sunday night, something stopped her. A feeling that she wasn't alone, that someone was watching her apartment building. She peered through her curtains and saw a dark sedan parked across the street, its occupants visible only as shadows behind tinted windows. The car hadn't been there earlier, and she didn't recognize it as belonging to any of her neighbors. Rachel's hands trembled as she saved her work and closed her laptop. The paranoia she felt seemed almost absurd. Surely she was imagining threats that didn't exist. But the car remained in place for the next hour, and when she checked again before going to bed, it was still there. Monday morning brought a new development that made her weekend paranoia seem prescient. Rachel arrived at work to find Kevin Walsh, a young IT specialist who had been helping her with the technical aspects of her podcast, waiting by her locker with an expression of barely controlled panic. "Rachel, we need to talk," he said urgently, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "I got a visit yesterday. 2 men in suits asking questions about podcast hosting platforms and IP addresses. They said they were conducting a routine investigation, but it didn't feel routine." Rachel's stomach dropped. "What kind of questions?" "They wanted to know about anonymous accounts, about how someone might upload content without leaving digital fingerprints. They specifically asked about nursing staff at Mercy General and whether I knew anyone who might have the technical knowledge to run a podcast." The walls were closing in faster than Rachel had anticipated. She had known that speaking out would involve risks, but she had underestimated how quickly and aggressively the hospital's leadership would respond. The fact that federal authorities were apparently involved suggested that Hoffman had resources and connections beyond what she had imagined. During her shift that day, Rachel noticed that her access to certain computer systems had been restricted. When she tried to look up patient billing information for legitimate work purposes, she received error messages indicating that her authorization level was insufficient. Other nurses seemed to be giving her a wider berth than usual, and she overheard whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she approached. The isolation was almost as difficult as the fear. For weeks, her investigation had been a solitary endeavor, something she pursued alone during quiet hours between shifts. But now that her actions were affecting her daily work life and relationships with colleagues, the personal cost was becoming clear. She was risking not just her job, but her entire career and professional reputation. That evening, as Rachel sat in her apartment reviewing the notes for her next episode, her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but something compelled her to answer. "Ms. Thompson?" The voice was professional, measured, with the kind of authority that suggested law enforcement training. "This is Agent David Reynolds, with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I think we need to talk." Rachel's blood turned to ice. "I'm sorry. What is this about?" "I think you know what this is about, Ms. Thompson. We've been monitoring certain online activities related to allegations of healthcare fraud in your area. I'd like to meet with you tomorrow to discuss your recent podcast episodes and the information you've been sharing publicly." The conversation was brief and formal, with Agent Reynolds providing minimal details about the nature of the investigation or Rachel's potential involvement. They arranged to meet the following afternoon at a coffee shop downtown, a public location that offered some measure of safety but little privacy. After hanging up, Rachel sat in her kitchen staring at the phone, the magnitude of her situation finally becoming clear. She wasn't just a nurse who had noticed some billing irregularities. She had stumbled into something big enough to attract federal attention. The question now was whether the FBI's interest was in investigating the fraud she had uncovered or in investigating her for exposing it. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Rachel lay in bed, listening to every sound in the building, jumping at footsteps in the hallway and car doors slamming on the street below. The dark sedan was gone from its previous position, but that provided little comfort. If federal agents were involved, they had resources far beyond what she could detect or evade. The next morning brought an unexpected source of support. Dr. Amanda Foster, a physician in the emergency department whom Rachel knew only by reputation, approached her during the morning shift change. Dr. Foster was known for her no-nonsense approach to patient care and her willingness to advocate for patients against administrative pressure. "Rachel," Dr. Foster said quietly, glancing around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard, "I've been listening to your podcast. What you're doing takes courage, and you should know that not everyone here disagrees with what you're saying." The words were carefully chosen, offering support without explicit admission of knowledge about illegal activities. But the message was clear. Rachel wasn't as alone as she had begun to feel. "There are others who have noticed the same things you're talking about," Dr. Foster continued. "Doctors who have questioned billing practices and been told to focus on medical care and leave administrative matters to others. We've been keeping our own records, documenting cases where financial considerations seem to override medical judgment." This revelation hit Rachel like a bolt of lightning. She wasn't the only one who had been investigating Mercy General's practices. There were others, professionals with more authority and credibility than she possessed, who had been conducting their own documentation of the hospital's corruption. "How many others?" Rachel asked. Dr. Foster's smile was grim. "More than you might expect. Hoffman and his associates have been very careful to compartmentalize information to make sure that no single person sees the full scope of what's happening. But when you start comparing notes across departments, patterns emerge." The meeting with Agent Reynolds was scheduled for 2 p.m. at Murphy's Corner, a small diner downtown that had been serving Cedar Falls for over 40 years. Rachel arrived 15 minutes early, choosing a booth near the back where she could observe the entrance while maintaining some privacy for conversation. Her hands shook slightly as she ordered coffee from the elderly waitress, who seemed to sense her nervousness and offered a reassuring smile. Agent Reynolds arrived precisely on time, and Rachel recognized him immediately, despite never having seen him before. There was something unmistakable about federal law enforcement officers, a combination of professionalism and authority that set them apart from local police or hospital security. He was younger than she had expected, probably in his early 40s, with sandy brown hair and observant eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of the diner as he approached her booth. "Ms. Thompson," he said, extending his hand as he slid into the seat across from her. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I know this situation must be stressful for you." His tone was surprisingly gentle, lacking the intimidation she had expected. This confused her more than outright hostility would have, leaving her uncertain about his intentions or the nature of the investigation. "Agent Reynolds," she replied, shaking his hand briefly. "I have to admit, I'm not sure why the FBI is interested in a small-town nurses podcast." Reynolds smiled slightly, the expression seeming genuine rather than practiced. "Small-town healthcare fraud can involve very large amounts of money, Ms. Thompson. When those amounts cross state lines or involve federal insurance programs, it becomes a federal matter." He opened a manila folder and removed several documents, spreading them across the table between them. Rachel's heart sank as she recognized photocopies of billing records she had discussed in her podcast episodes, documents that she had accessed through her work at the hospital. "Before we go any further," Reynolds said, "I want to make sure you understand your rights. You're not under arrest, and you're free to leave at any time. However, the information you've been sharing publicly could potentially be considered evidence in a federal investigation, and how you obtained that information is relevant to our inquiry." The careful phrasing told Rachel that she was walking a tightrope. Her podcast had clearly attracted attention from multiple directions, and while she wasn't being arrested, she wasn't exactly being protected either. "I haven't shared any confidential patient information," Rachel said carefully. "Everything I've discussed was based on my own observations and publicly available records." Reynolds nodded slowly. "We're aware of that, and it's actually part of why I wanted to speak with you. The billing records you've been referencing aren't typically accessible to nursing staff. How exactly did you come across them?" This was the question Rachel had been dreading. Answering honestly might expose her to charges related to unauthorized access to confidential information. Lying to a federal agent would be infinitely worse. "I came across them during the normal course of my work," she said, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes nurses need to verify billing information for patient care purposes, and I began noticing discrepancies between what was being charged and what was actually provided." It was technically true, though it omitted the systematic nature of her investigation and the deliberate searching she had done to gather evidence. Reynolds seemed to understand what she wasn't saying, but he didn't press the point immediately. "Ms. Thompson, I'm going to share something with you that I hope will make this conversation more productive for both of us," Reynolds said, leaning forward slightly. "You're not the target of our investigation. In fact, your podcast has provided valuable corroboration for an investigation that was already underway." The relief that flooded through Rachel was so intense that she felt momentarily dizzy. An investigation that was already underway? "Healthcare fraud investigations often take months or years to develop," Reynolds explained. "We've been looking into irregularities in Medicare and Medicaid billing from several hospitals in this region for over a year. Mercy General has been of particular interest, but gathering evidence in healthcare fraud cases is complicated. Your podcast has provided external confirmation of patterns we've been tracking internally. This revelation reframed everything Rachel thought she understood about her situation. Rather than being a lone whistleblower exposing unknown corruption, she had stumbled into the middle of an ongoing federal investigation. Her podcast hadn't started the inquiry, it had simply made it public. "What happens now?" Rachel asked. Reynolds gathered the documents from the table and returned them to his folder. "That depends partly on you. We'd like your cooperation as a witness in the investigation, which would mean providing formal statements about what you've observed and potentially testifying if the case goes to trial. In exchange, you'd receive full whistleblower protections under federal law." The offer was more than Rachel had dared to hope for, but it also represented a point of no return. Cooperating with the federal investigation would mean formally becoming a government witness against her employer and colleagues, a role that would fundamentally change her relationship with the medical community in Cedar Falls. "I need some time to think about it," Rachel said. Reynolds nodded and handed her a business card. "Of course. But Ms. Thompson, I want you to understand something important. Whether or not you cooperate with our investigation, your podcast has already put you in a certain amount of danger. The people involved in this fraud have significant financial incentives to discredit or silence you. Federal witness protection isn't just about legal protection, it's about physical safety." The drive back to her apartment gave Rachel time to process what she had learned. The dark sedan was back, parked in the same location across from her building, but now she understood that it might represent protection rather than surveillance. The FBI's involvement meant that her situation was both more serious and more hopeful than she had realized. That evening, as she prepared what would be her 4th podcast episode, Rachel felt a strange sense of calm settling over her. The isolation and fear that had been building over the past week were being replaced by something that felt like clarity. She wasn't fighting this battle alone anymore, and she had resources and protection that she hadn't known existed. But she also understood that the most dangerous phase of her journey was just beginning. Going public with her cooperation in a federal investigation would make her a target for anyone with a financial stake in keeping Mercy General's practices hidden. The comfortable anonymity she had maintained while working as a nurse in a small town was about to disappear forever. As she prepared to record, Rachel thought about all the patients whose stories had led her to this moment. Margaret Foster, whose husband had been charged for procedures he never received. The Santos family, struggling with bills for medical care that had never been provided. The dozens of people who had reached out through her podcast to share their own experiences with medical billing fraud. She owed them the truth, regardless of the personal cost. And now, with federal law enforcement backing her up, she finally had the resources to ensure that truth would be heard and acted upon. The corruption at Mercy General was about to be exposed, not just through a nurse's late-night podcast, but through the full weight of the federal justice system. The recording light on her microphone pulsed red as Rachel leaned forward and began to speak, her voice stronger and more confident than it had ever been before. Rachel's 4th podcast episode went live at exactly midnight on Thursday, but this time everything was different. Instead of recording alone in her cramped kitchen, she sat in a secure conference room at the federal building in downtown Columbus, surrounded by sophisticated recording equipment and legal advisors. Agent Reynolds had arranged for professional audio technicians to ensure the highest quality broadcast, and a team of attorneys had reviewed every word of her script to ensure it met legal standards for evidence presentation. The episode opened with a statement that sent shockwaves through Cedar Falls and the broader medical community. Rachel's voice, now steady with the confidence that comes from knowing you're backed by the full power of federal law enforcement, delivered words that had been carefully crafted to achieve maximum impact while maintaining legal precision. Good evening. This is Rachel Thompson, and tonight I'm speaking to you not just as a concerned nurse, but as a cooperating witness in a federal investigation into systematic healthcare fraud. What I'm about to share with you has been verified by federal investigators and represents just a small portion of evidence that will soon be presented in federal court. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the episode had been downloaded 50,000 times. Major news outlets began reaching out for interviews. Social media exploded with discussions about healthcare fraud and corporate accountability. But most importantly for Rachel, the veil of secrecy that had protected Mercy General's corrupt practices for years was finally being torn away in the most public manner possible. Dr. Marcus Hoffman's reaction was swift and desperate. By Friday morning, he had called an emergency meeting of the hospital's board of directors and had hired one of the state's most expensive crisis management firms. Security at Mercy General was increased dramatically, with armed guards now stationed at every entrance and exit. All computer access was restricted to essential personnel only, and several employees found themselves placed on administrative leave pending routine security reviews. But Hoffman's most significant mistake was underestimating the network of support that had been quietly building around Rachel. Dr. Amanda Foster had not been exaggerating when she mentioned that others had been documenting the hospital's questionable practices. On Friday afternoon, as Hoffman was meeting with lawyers and public relations specialists, 5 physicians and 12 nurses simultaneously submitted formal complaints to the state medical board, each backed by months of carefully documented evidence. The coordinated action had been planned in secret over the previous week, organized through encrypted messaging apps and private meetings in locations far from the hospital. Dr. Foster had served as the unofficial coordinator, reaching out to colleagues who had expressed concerns about billing practices and patient care standards. What had started as individual observations and private frustrations had been transformed into a unified front of medical professionals willing to risk their careers to expose the truth. Lisa Martinez was among those who stepped forward, finally, finding the courage to speak publicly about what she had witnessed in the cardiac unit. Her testimony was particularly damaging because it included evidence of patients being subjected to unnecessary procedures, specifically because those procedures generated higher billing rates. She had documented cases where patients with minor cardiac issues had been subjected to invasive procedures that carried significant risks, all because the hospital could bill insurance companies at premium rates for complex interventions. The revelation that multiple hospital departments were involved in systematic fraud expanded the scope of the federal investigation exponentially. What had initially appeared to be isolated billing irregularities was now revealed as a hospital-wide conspiracy that had been operating for years. The financial scope was staggering, with preliminary estimates suggesting that tens of millions of dollars had been fraudulently extracted from patients and insurance companies over the previous 5 years. Kevin Walsh, the IT specialist who had been helping Rachel with her podcast, found himself in an unexpected position of importance when federal investigators discovered that his computer skills had helped preserve digital evidence that might otherwise have been destroyed. His analysis of the hospital's computer systems revealed a sophisticated scheme to alter billing records retroactively, making fraudulent charges appear legitimate by backdating them and creating false documentation to support them. The digital forensics evidence was particularly compelling because it showed clear patterns of systematic manipulation rather than random errors. Billing codes were consistently upgraded to more expensive categories without corresponding changes in patient treatment. Procedures were added to patient records days or weeks after discharge, often by administrators who had never seen the patients in question. The electronic trail painted a picture of deliberate and coordinated fraud that would be nearly impossible to explain away as clerical errors. Meanwhile, Rachel found herself thrust into a spotlight she had never sought or wanted. Her quiet life as an anonymous nurse was replaced by a whirlwind of media interviews, legal depositions, and security briefings. Federal marshals provided protection when credible threats against her safety were discovered, and she was relocated to a secure apartment while the investigation proceeded. The personal cost was significant. Rachel's relationship with her family became strained as the publicity surrounding the case made normal interactions impossible. Her elderly parents, who lived in a retirement community outside Cedar Falls, found themselves fielding questions from neighbors and reporters about their daughter's role in the investigation. The stress affected her father's health, and Rachel struggled with guilt about the unintended consequences of her decision to speak out. But the support she received from unexpected sources helped sustain her through the difficult period. Patients and families who had been victimized by Mercy General's practices began reaching out directly, sharing their stories and expressing gratitude for her courage in exposing the fraud. Their testimonies provided emotional validation for the personal sacrifices she was making and reminded her of why she had started the podcast in the first place. One particularly powerful message came from Margaret Foster, the elderly woman, whose husband had been charged for procedures he never received. Margaret had driven 3 hours to attend one of Rachel's court appearances, waiting outside the federal courthouse just to thank her in person. "My Harold always said that when good people stay silent, bad people win," Margaret told Rachel, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "You didn't stay silent, and now my Harold's memory means something." The federal investigation moved with surprising speed once Rachel's cooperation was secured. Agent Reynolds explained that healthcare fraud cases typically took years to develop, but the evidence Rachel and her colleagues had provided was so comprehensive and well documented that prosecutors were able to move directly to seeking indictments. Grand jury proceedings began within weeks, and federal agents executed search warrants at Mercy General and Dr. Hoffman's private offices simultaneously on a Tuesday morning in November. The raids were conducted with military precision, involving dozens of federal agents and forensic accountants who spent 12 hours methodically cataloging evidence and seizing computer systems. Video footage of agents carrying boxes of documents from the hospital's administrative offices made national news, and the image of Dr. Hoffman being escorted from his office in handcuffs became a symbol of accountability in healthcare. But the most dramatic moment came when the federal agents discovered something that even Rachel hadn't anticipated. Hidden in a concealed safe in Hoffman's office were handwritten ledgers detailing cash payments to state health inspectors and insurance company executives. The corruption extended far beyond Mercy General itself, involving a network of bribes and kickbacks that had allowed the fraudulent practices to continue undetected for years. The revelation that state regulators had been compromised transformed the case from a local healthcare fraud investigation into a major corruption scandal, with implications for the entire state's medical regulatory system. Federal prosecutors expanded their investigation to include the state health department and several insurance companies, ultimately leading to indictments against more than 30 individuals across multiple organizations. Rachel's role as the catalyst for this massive investigation brought her both recognition and unwanted attention. She was invited to testify before congressional committees about healthcare fraud and regulatory oversight. Medical journals published articles about her case as an example of the importance of healthcare worker whistleblowing. Patient advocacy groups held rallies in her honor, praising her courage in standing up to powerful corporate interests. But the attention also brought threats and harassment from those whose financial interests were threatened by the investigation. Anonymous phone calls warned her to recant her testimony. Her car was vandalized multiple times. Online harassment campaigns attempted to discredit her by spreading false information about her personal life and professional qualifications. The psychological toll was significant, and Rachel found herself struggling with anxiety and depression. As the weight of public scrutiny combined with the stress of ongoing legal proceedings, Federal Victim Services provided counseling and support, but the fundamental challenge remained. Her life had been permanently altered by her decision to speak out, and there was no returning to the quiet anonymity she had once enjoyed. Dr. Foster emerged as an unexpected source of strength during this difficult period. Having faced her own professional challenges for supporting Rachel's investigation, Dr. Foster understood the isolation that came with challenging, powerful institutional interests. She organized a support network of healthcare workers who had faced retaliation for reporting unethical practices, providing Rachel with a community of people who understood the unique challenges of medical whistleblowing. The support network expanded beyond Cedar Falls as news of the case spread through professional medical communities across the country. Nurses and physicians from other hospitals reached out to share their own experiences with healthcare fraud and to offer solidarity with Rachel's efforts. Many revealed that they had observed similar practices at their own institutions, but had been afraid to speak out because of the potential career consequences. This broader community of support helped Rachel understand that her experience at Mercy General was not an isolated incident, but part of a systemic problem affecting healthcare institutions nationwide. The federal investigation she had triggered was revealing patterns of fraud that extended far beyond a single hospital, involving networks of corrupt administrators, compromised regulators, and complicit insurance executives. As the investigation expanded, Rachel found herself serving as an informal advisor to other healthcare workers who were considering reporting fraud at their own institutions. Her experience navigating the complex legal and professional challenges of medical whistleblowing made her a valuable resource for others facing similar decisions. She began speaking at conferences and workshops about healthcare ethics and the importance of professional integrity in medical practice. The transformation from quiet nurse to national advocate was both empowering and overwhelming. Rachel had never imagined herself as a public figure, but the circumstances had thrust her into a role that she gradually learned to embrace. Her natural empathy and genuine concern for patient welfare made her an effective spokesperson for healthcare reform, and her first-hand experience with the realities of medical fraud gave her credibility that professional advocates often lacked. The legal proceedings against Dr. Hoffman and his co-conspirators moved through the federal court system with unprecedented speed for such a complex case. The evidence was so overwhelming and well documented that most defendants chose to bargain rather than risk trial. Hoffman himself maintained his innocence publicly, while his lawyers worked behind the scenes to negotiate a plea agreement that would minimize his prison sentence. The financial restitution ordered by the court was substantial, with millions of dollars being returned to patients and insurance companies who had been defrauded. Mercy General itself faced potential bankruptcy as federal fines and civil judgments mounted, leading to discussions about the hospital being taken over by a non-profit healthcare system that could restore ethical practices and community trust. For Rachel, the legal vindication was satisfying but also bittersweet. The corruption she had exposed was finally being addressed through the justice system, but the personal cost of achieving that justice had been enormous. Her nursing career at Mercy General was obviously over, and her reputation in the local medical community was forever changed by her role in the investigation. Yet as she sat in the federal courthouse watching Dr. Hoffman accept a plea agreement that included a 10-year prison sentence and millions of dollars in restitution, Rachel felt a sense of completion that made all the sacrifices worthwhile. The patients who had been victimized by the hospital's fraudulent practices would finally receive justice, and the systemic corruption that had allowed those practices to continue had been permanently dismantled. The moment was captured by dozens of cameras and reporters, but Rachel barely noticed the media attention. Her focus was entirely on the knowledge that her decision to speak out had ultimately protected future patients from experiencing the same fraud and abuse that had motivated her to start the podcast in the first place. The quiet nurse, who had recorded her first episode in a cramped apartment kitchen, had become an agent of justice whose actions had reverberations far beyond anything she could have imagined. The Cedar Falls Community Center had never hosted an event quite like the one that took place on a cold December evening 6 months after Rachel's final podcast episode. The gymnasium, normally reserved for high school basketball games and school board meetings, was packed with over 800 people, representing a cross-section of the entire community. Patients who had been defrauded by Mercy General sat alongside nurses who had risked their careers to expose the corruption. Federal investigators mingled with local reporters, while family members of affected patients shared their stories with anyone willing to listen. Rachel walked into the gymnasium through a side entrance, hoping to avoid the media attention that had become a constant presence in her life. She wore a simple blue dress, professional but understated, her hair pulled back in the same practical style she had favored during her nursing career. The transformation from anonymous healthcare worker to public figure was still uncomfortable for her, but she had learned to navigate the attention with grace and dignity that impressed even seasoned federal prosecutors. The evening had been organized by the Cedar Falls Patient Advocacy Coalition, a grassroots organization that had formed spontaneously in response to the revelations about Mercy General's fraudulent practices. What had started as informal conversations between affected families had evolved into a formal non-profit dedicated to ensuring accountability in local healthcare and supporting other communities facing similar challenges. Judge Patricia Coleman, who had presided over the federal criminal cases resulting from Rachel's investigation, served as the evening's keynote speaker. Her presence lent an air of official gravity to the proceedings, but her message was ultimately one of hope and community resilience. Judge Coleman had seen hundreds of fraud cases during her decades on the federal bench, but the Mercy General investigation had stood out for both its scope and the grassroots nature of its exposure. Tonight, we gather not to celebrate the downfall of individuals, but to recognize the power of ordinary citizens to demand accountability from institutions that serve them, Judge Coleman began, her voice carrying easily through the gymnasium's sound system. What happened here in Cedar Falls represents both a failure of institutional oversight and a triumph of individual courage. The audience included faces that had become familiar to Rachel over the months of investigation and legal proceedings. Margaret Foster sat in the front row, wearing the same dignified expression she had maintained throughout her husband's posthumous vindication. The Santos family occupied an entire row, their children now old enough to understand that their mother's medical bills had been fraudulent and that justice had finally been served. Dr. Amanda Foster had been invited to speak about the medical community's response to the revelations, and her remarks focused on the systematic changes that had been implemented to prevent similar fraud in the future. The State Medical Board had overhauled its oversight procedures, implementing new requirements for financial transparency and patient advocacy that had become a model for other states. The courage shown by Rachel Thompson and her colleagues has fundamentally changed how we approach healthcare accountability, Dr. Foster explained to the assembled crowd. But more importantly, it has reminded us that our primary obligation as healthcare professionals is to our patients, not to the institutions that employ us. The evening's program included video messages from healthcare workers across the country who had been inspired by Rachel's example to report fraud and abuse at their own institutions. A pediatric nurse in Arizona had exposed a scheme involving unnecessary surgeries on children. An emergency room physician in Florida had documented systematic overcharging of uninsured patients. A medical technician in Oregon had revealed equipment fraud that had put patients at risk during critical procedures. Each story followed a similar pattern: healthcare workers noticing irregularities, struggling with the decision to speak out, facing institutional retaliation, and ultimately finding support through federal investigation and community advocacy. The pattern suggested that the problems exposed at Mercy General were symptomatic of broader issues in the American healthcare system, issues that required ongoing vigilance and advocacy to address. Kevin Walsh, now working as a cybersecurity consultant specializing in healthcare fraud detection, presented a technical overview of the digital forensics that had been crucial to proving the systematic nature of Mercy General's fraud. His presentation included charts and graphs that made the complex financial manipulations comprehensible to a general audience, showing how billing codes had been systematically altered and how electronic records had been manipulated to create false documentation. The technical presentation was followed by personal testimonies from patients and families who had been directly affected by the fraudulent billing practices. These stories provided the human context that made the statistical evidence emotionally meaningful, reminding the audience that healthcare fraud was not a victimless crime, but a violation of trust that caused real harm to real people. Robert Chen, the elderly man whose routine blood work had generated bills for complex cardiac procedures he had never received, spoke about the months of confusion and fear he had experienced when trying to understand his medical bills. His testimony was particularly powerful because it illustrated how fraud targeting vulnerable populations like the elderly could cause psychological trauma that extended far beyond financial harm. "I started questioning my own memory," Chen explained, his voice steady but emotional. "The bills said I had received all these procedures, but I couldn't remember them. I thought maybe I was developing dementia, that I was losing my mind. It wasn't until I heard Rachel's podcast that I realized the problem wasn't with my memory." The evening also included recognition of the federal agents and prosecutors who had handled the investigation with professionalism and dedication. Agent Reynolds received particular acknowledgement for his sensitive handling of the case and his commitment to protecting the healthcare workers who had served as witnesses. His approach had become a model for federal law enforcement agencies, dealing with healthcare fraud cases in other jurisdictions. But the most anticipated moment of the evening came when Rachel herself was invited to address the community. She had spoken at numerous conferences and congressional hearings over the previous months, but this was different. This was her home community, the people whose trust in their local hospital had been violated, the colleagues whose careers had been affected by her decision to speak out. Rachel approached the microphone with visible nervousness, but her voice was strong and clear when she began to speak. "6 months ago, I was just a nurse trying to do my job and take care of patients. I never intended to become a public figure or a symbol of anything. I just saw something wrong and felt compelled to speak up about it." She paused, looking out over the crowd of familiar and unfamiliar faces, people whose lives had been touched by the events she had set in motion. "What I've learned through this experience is that individual courage only matters when it's supported by community action. My podcast was just the beginning. The real change came when all of you decided that accountability mattered more than convenience, that justice was worth the disruption it caused. Rachel's remarks focused on the broader lessons that could be drawn from the Mercy General case, particularly the importance of institutional transparency and the role of ordinary citizens in maintaining accountability. She emphasized that healthcare fraud was not just a financial crime, but a violation of the fundamental trust that patients place in medical institutions during their most vulnerable moments. Every patient who walks through the doors of a hospital has a right to expect that their care will be guided by medical necessity, not financial opportunity, Rachel continued. When that trust is violated, it affects not just individual patients, but the entire community's faith in the healthcare system. The response from the audience was overwhelming, with sustained applause that seemed to express not just appreciation for Rachel's courage, but recognition of the collective effort that had been required to achieve justice. The applause was joined by people standing throughout the gymnasium, creating a moment of community solidarity that transcended the individual case and spoke to broader values of accountability and integrity. Following the formal program, the evening continued with smaller group discussions where community members could share their own experiences and discuss ongoing concerns about healthcare accessibility and accountability. These conversations revealed that while the criminal aspects of the Mercy General case had been resolved, the underlying issues of healthcare affordability and transparency remained significant challenges for many families. The discussions also highlighted the positive changes that had resulted from the investigation. Mercy General had been acquired by a non-profit healthcare system that had implemented new policies emphasizing patient advocacy and financial transparency. Billing practices were now subject to regular external audits, and patient representatives were available to help families understand and question their medical bills. The state had also implemented new regulations requiring hospitals to provide clear, itemized billing statements and to maintain patient advocacy programs. These changes had been directly influenced by the testimony and evidence provided during the federal investigation, demonstrating how individual whistleblowing could lead to systematic policy reforms. Rachel found herself engaged in dozens of individual conversations throughout the evening, with community members expressing gratitude for her courage and sharing their own experiences with healthcare challenges. Many spoke about how her example had inspired them to be more assertive in questioning medical bills and advocating for appropriate care. One particularly meaningful conversation was with a young nursing student from the local community college who had been inspired by Rachel's example to pursue a career in healthcare advocacy. "You showed me that being a nurse isn't just about following orders," the student explained. "It's about being willing to stand up for patients, even when it's difficult or dangerous." These interactions reminded Rachel that the impact of her actions extended far beyond the specific fraud she had exposed. By demonstrating that individual healthcare workers could successfully challenge institutional corruption, she had inspired a new generation of medical professionals to prioritize patient welfare over institutional loyalty. The evening concluded with the presentation of a Community Service Award to Rachel, recognizing her contribution to healthcare accountability and patient advocacy. The award was presented by Mayor Jennifer Walsh, who had been elected partly on a platform of increased transparency in local government and healthcare oversight. "Rachel Thompson represents the best of what we can be as a community," Mayor Walsh said during the presentation. "She saw injustice and chose to act despite the personal cost and professional risk. Her courage has made our entire community stronger and more vigilant about protecting the vulnerable among us." Rachel accepted the award with characteristic humility, emphasizing that the recognition belonged to everyone who had supported the investigation and worked to implement reforms. "This award doesn't belong to me alone," she said. "It belongs to every patient who shared their story, every healthcare worker who chose conscience over convenience, and every community member who demanded accountability." As the evening wound down and people began to leave the community center, Rachel found herself surrounded by a small group of local nurses who had supported her throughout the investigation. Many had faced their own professional challenges for their association with her case, but they expressed no regrets about their decision to support transparency and accountability. Lisa Martinez, who had been rehired by the new non-profit system, managing Mercy General, spoke for the group when she said, "What you did changed everything for all of us. We're not just nurses anymore, we're advocates. We understand now that speaking up isn't just our right, it's our responsibility." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a group of patients and family members who had been affected by the fraudulent billing practices. They had organized themselves to present Rachel with a handwritten book containing hundreds of thank you messages from people whose lives had been touched by her courage. Margaret Foster, now serving as an informal spokesperson for the affected families, presented the book to Rachel with tears in her eyes. "We wanted you to have something to remind you that what you did mattered," she said. "Every time you doubt whether it was worth it, we want you to remember that you gave us our voices back." The gift was overwhelming for Rachel, who had struggled at times with the personal costs of her decision to speak out. Reading through the messages later that evening, she was struck by the recurring themes of gratitude, empowerment, and renewed faith in the possibility of justice. The messages came from people of all ages and backgrounds, united by their experience of victimization and their appreciation for someone who had been willing to fight on their behalf. One message particularly stood out, written by a young mother, whose newborn had been charged for procedures that were never performed. "My daughter will grow up in a world where people like you exist," the message read. "That gives me hope that she'll never have to face the kind of fraud we experienced, because there will always be people willing to stand up for what's right." As Rachel left the community center that evening, surrounded by friends and supporters, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The quiet nurse who had started a late-night podcast had become a national advocate for healthcare transparency, but more importantly, she had helped create a community of people committed to maintaining accountability in their healthcare system. The personal costs had been significant. Her quiet life had been permanently disrupted, her privacy was gone, and her career path had been fundamentally altered. But the evening's events had reinforced her conviction that those sacrifices had been worthwhile. The lives that had been changed, the reforms that had been implemented, and the inspiration that had been provided to others facing similar challenges justified the difficulties she had endured. Standing outside the community center as people slowly dispersed into the cold December night, Rachel felt a sense of completion that had been missing throughout the months of investigation and legal proceedings. Justice had been served, reforms had been implemented, and the community had demonstrated its commitment to holding healthcare institutions accountable. The work was far from over, but the foundation had been laid for ongoing vigilance and advocacy. 2 years had passed since that December evening at the Cedar Falls Community Center, and Rachel Thompson found herself standing in a place she never could have imagined when she first pressed record on her laptop in her cramped apartment kitchen. The headquarters of the National Healthcare Accountability Foundation occupied 3 floors of a gleaming office building in Washington, D.C., and Rachel's corner office on the 2nd floor overlooked the Potomac River through floor to ceiling, windows that let in streams of golden afternoon sunlight. The transformation from small-town nurse to national healthcare advocate had been gradual but profound. What had started as a desperate attempt to expose corruption at a single hospital had evolved into a comprehensive organization dedicated to supporting healthcare workers who witnessed fraud, abuse, or negligence in medical institutions across the country. The foundation provided legal support, financial assistance, and emotional counseling to healthcare professionals who chose to speak out against institutional wrongdoing, addressing the gaps in protection that Rachel had discovered during her own difficult journey. The office walls were lined with letters and photographs from healthcare workers whose lives had been changed by the foundation's support. There was a picture of Dr. Maria Rodriguez, a pediatric surgeon in Texas who had exposed unnecessary surgeries being performed on children for financial gain. Another photograph showed James Mitchell, a laboratory technician in Michigan, who had revealed that his hospital was using expired reagents in blood tests to save money, potentially compromising patient safety. Each story represented a victory for patient safety and healthcare integrity, but Rachel understood that they also represented individual human beings who had risked everything to do what they believed was right. The foundation's work was about more than exposing corruption. It was about creating a culture in healthcare where speaking up for patients was seen as a professional obligation rather than an act of disloyalty. The foundation's success had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Congressional committees regularly consulted with Rachel about healthcare fraud legislation. Medical schools invited her to speak about professional ethics and the importance of patient advocacy. Healthcare policy think tanks sought her input on regulatory reforms that could prevent the kind of systematic fraud she had exposed at Mercy General. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition had come from an unexpected source. The previous month, Rachel had received a handwritten letter from Dr. Marcus Hoffman, the former administrator whose corruption she had exposed. Written from the federal prison where he was serving his sentence, the letter was a lengthy apology that acknowledged the harm his actions had caused to patients and the broader community. "I have had much time to reflect on my choices and their consequences," Hoffman had written. "While I cannot undo the harm I caused, I want you to know that your courage in exposing the truth has led to changes that will protect countless patients in the future. What I thought was clever financial management was actually a betrayal of everything healthcare is supposed to represent." The letter had been difficult for Rachel to read, not because it lacked sincerity, but because it reminded her of the human complexity underlying even the most clear-cut cases of institutional corruption. Hoffman's crimes had been real and had caused genuine harm to vulnerable patients, but his acknowledgement of wrongdoing and apparent genuine remorse complicated the simple narrative of good versus evil that had characterized much of the media coverage of the case. Rachel had shared the letter with Dr. Amanda Foster, who had become not just a professional colleague, but a close personal friend during the years since the Mercy General investigation. Dr. Foster now served as the Foundation's medical director, bringing her clinical expertise and administrative experience to the organization's mission of supporting healthcare whistleblowers. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting," Dr. Foster had observed after reading Hoffman's letter. "It means acknowledging that people can change, and that justice isn't just about punishment, but about creating conditions that prevent future harm." The conversation had taken place in Rachel's office during one of their weekly strategy meetings, where they reviewed pending cases and planned the Foundation's expanding programs. The organization now employed 37 people, including lawyers, social workers, investigators, and support staff who worked with healthcare professionals facing retaliation for reporting wrongdoing. One of the Foundation's most successful programs was a secure digital platform that allowed healthcare workers to report suspected fraud or abuse anonymously, while maintaining detailed documentation that could later be used in formal investigations. The platform had processed over 1,500 reports in its first year of operation, leading to investigations at dozens of healthcare institutions across the country. The platform's success had attracted the attention of federal law enforcement agencies who had come to view the Foundation as a valuable partner in identifying healthcare fraud. Agent Reynolds, who had led the original Mercy General investigation, now served on the Foundation's advisory board and helped train other federal agents in working effectively with healthcare whistleblowers. What Rachel created here goes far beyond any single case, Reynolds had explained during a recent board meeting. She's built an infrastructure that allows individual acts of courage to become systematic change. That's something law enforcement agencies can't do on their own. The Foundation's work had also attracted international attention, with healthcare advocates from other countries studying their model and adapting it to their own regulatory systems. A delegation from the United Kingdom had spent a week at the Foundation's headquarters learning about their legal support programs, while representatives from Canada and Australia had implemented similar digital reporting platforms in their own healthcare systems. But Rachel's proudest achievement was the scholarship program the Foundation had established for nursing students who demonstrated a commitment to patient advocacy and ethical practice. The program provided financial support for education and professional development, but more importantly, it created a network of healthcare professionals who understood from the beginning of their careers that patient welfare should always take precedence over institutional loyalty. The first class of scholarship recipients had graduated the previous spring, and Rachel had attended as many graduation ceremonies as her schedule allowed. Seeing young nurses walk across stages wearing pins that identified them as patient advocacy scholars, she was reminded of her own graduation years earlier and the idealism that had motivated her to enter healthcare in the first place. One scholarship recipient, a young man named David Kim, had sent Rachel a letter after his graduation describing how the Foundation's support had influenced his approach to nursing practice. Knowing that there are people like you who will stand behind healthcare workers who speak up for patients has given me the confidence to see my role as more than just following orders, he had written. I understand now that being a nurse means being willing to be uncomfortable when patient safety is at stake. The letter had arrived on a particularly difficult day when Rachel was struggling with the weight of responsibility that came with leading a national organization. The Foundation's success had brought new challenges, including increased scrutiny from healthcare industry lobbyists who viewed their work as threatening to hospital profits and administrative authority. Some criticism had been fair and constructive, leading to improvements in the Foundation's procedures and policies, but other attacks had been personal and vindictive, questioning Rachel's motives and qualifications in ways that echoed the intimidation she had faced during the original Mercy General investigation. The most difficult challenge had come 6 months earlier, when a healthcare industry trade association had funded a coordinated campaign to discredit the Foundation's work. The campaign had included negative media coverage, questioning the accuracy of the Foundation's reports and suggesting that their support for whistleblowers was motivated by financial rather than ethical considerations. Rachel had initially been devastated by the attacks, particularly because they seemed to undermine the very principles that had motivated her to start speaking out in the first place. The suggestion that her advocacy was motivated by personal gain rather than genuine concern for patients struck at the core of her identity as a healthcare professional. But the response from the Foundation's supporters had been overwhelming and heartening. Hundreds of healthcare workers had written letters defending the organization's work and sharing their own experiences with the Foundation's programs. Patients and families who had been helped by investigations initiated through the Foundation's reporting platform had organized their own media campaign highlighting the real-world impact of the organization's work. Most powerfully, Margaret Foster had organized a group of Cedar Falls residents to travel to Washington and hold a press conference outside the foundation's headquarters. The elderly woman who had become an informal spokesperson for Mercy Generals. Victims stood before a bank of television cameras and microphones to deliver a simple but powerful message. Rachel Thompson saved my family from financial ruin and gave meaning to my husband's suffering, Margaret had declared, her voice strong despite her advanced age. Anyone who questions her motives has never sat in a hospital billing office trying to understand charges for procedures that were never performed on someone they loved. The press conference had effectively ended the industry association's campaign against the foundation, but more importantly for Rachel, it had demonstrated the enduring power of the relationships she had built with the people whose lives had been affected by her initial decision to speak out. The memory of Margaret's fierce defense of the foundation's work had sustained Rachel through the subsequent months of growth and expansion. The organization had opened regional offices in Chicago and Los Angeles, extending their reach to healthcare. Workers in different parts of the country who faced unique local challenges and regulatory environments. Each new office brought new stories of courage and complexity. In Los Angeles, they had supported a group of emergency room nurses who exposed a hospital's practice of turning away uninsured patients. In Chicago, they had worked with a radiologist who discovered that his hospital was using faulty equipment that produced unclear images, leading to misdiagnoses and inappropriate treatments. The pattern was always similar. Healthcare professionals who noticed something wrong, struggled with the decision to speak out, faced institutional retaliation, and ultimately found support through the Foundation's programs. But each case was also unique, involving specific clinical contexts and regulatory environments that required individualized approaches and solutions. The Foundation's legal team had become particularly skilled at navigating the complex web of federal and state laws that governed healthcare whistleblowing. They had successfully defended healthcare workers against wrongful termination lawsuits, helped secure federal witness protection for those facing threats, and lobbied for legislative changes that would strengthen legal protections for medical professionals who report institutional wrongdoing. One of their most significant legal victories had come in a case involving a psychiatric nurse who had exposed the inappropriate use of chemical restraints on elderly patients with dementia. The hospital had attempted to fire the nurse for violating patient confidentiality, but the Foundation's lawyers had successfully argued that reporting abuse was not only protected, but required under both federal law and professional nursing standards. The case had established important legal precedents that strengthened protections for healthcare whistleblowers, but it had also highlighted the ongoing need for cultural change within medical institutions. Legal protections were important, but they were insufficient without a broader shift toward viewing patient advocacy as a core professional responsibility rather than an act of betrayal. Rachel's work with the Foundation had also led to unexpected personal growth and healing. The isolation and fear she had experienced during the original investigation had been replaced by a sense of purpose and community that she had never imagined possible. She had found a way to transform her own difficult experience into support for others facing similar challenges. The Foundation's work had also brought her into contact with remarkable individuals whose courage and integrity had inspired her own continued commitment to the cause. She had met doctors who had risked prestigious academic appointments to report research fraud, nurses who had faced death threats for exposing patient abuse, and healthcare administrators who had sacrificed lucrative careers to protect vulnerable populations. Each of these relationships had reinforced her understanding that healthcare integrity was not about individual heroism, but about creating systems and cultures that supported ethical behavior even when it was difficult or costly. The Foundation's success was not measured just in the number of cases they handled or the amount of fraud they helped expose, but in the gradual shift toward greater accountability and transparency in healthcare institutions across the country. As Rachel stood in her office that afternoon, reviewing the Foundation's annual report before its release to the public, she was struck by the distance she had traveled from that night in her apartment kitchen when she had first pressed record. On her laptop, the quiet nurse who had been afraid to speak up during staff meetings had become a national voice for healthcare accountability. But more importantly, she had helped create a movement that was larger than any individual story or case. The annual report documented the Foundation's impact in concrete terms. 247 healthcare workers supported through legal challenges. 89 federal investigations initiated based on reports through their platform. $127 million in fraudulent billing. Identified and stopped, and countless patients protected from unnecessary procedures and inappropriate care. But the statistics only told part of the story. The real measure of the Foundation's success was in the letters that continued to arrive from healthcare workers who had found the courage to speak up because they knew support was available, from patients who had received appropriate care because someone was willing to advocate for them, and from communities that had demanded accountability from their healthcare institutions. The Foundation's work was far from complete. Healthcare fraud continued to affect millions of patients across the country, and the pressure on medical professionals to prioritize financial considerations over patient welfare remained strong in many institutions. But Rachel was confident that the infrastructure they had built would continue to support those who chose conscience over convenience, courage over comfort. As the afternoon sun began to set over the Potomac, casting long shadows, across her office, Rachel received a call that reminded her why the Foundation's work remained essential. A young pediatric nurse in Nevada was reporting that children in her hospital's cancer ward were being charged for chemotherapy drugs that were never administered, with expired medications being substituted to cut costs. The call was heartbreaking, but not surprising. Healthcare fraud took many forms, but it always involved the exploitation of vulnerable people during their most desperate moments. The nurse on the phone was terrified of the potential consequences of speaking out, but she was more afraid of staying silent while children received inadequate treatment for life-threatening illnesses. "I've been listening to your story for months," the nurse explained, her voice trembling with emotion. "I kept hoping someone else would notice and report it, but I realize now that I'm the someone else. I can't let these kids suffer because I'm scared." Rachel spent an hour on the call, providing reassurance and practical guidance while her legal team prepared to begin an investigation. By the end of the conversation, the nurse sounded calmer and more confident, knowing that she wouldn't face the consequences of speaking out alone. As Rachel hung up the phone, she reflected on how many similar calls she had received over the years and how each one represented both a tragedy and an opportunity. The tragedy was that corruption and abuse continued to occur in healthcare institutions. Across the country, the opportunity was that more healthcare workers were finding the courage to speak out, knowing that support and protection were available. The evening news was beginning on the television in Rachel's office, and the lead story was about a major healthcare fraud case in Texas that had been initiated based on reports through the Foundation's platform. Watching the coverage, Rachel felt the same mixture of satisfaction and sadness that accompanied all such victories. Justice was being served, but only after patients had been harmed and trust had been violated. As she prepared to leave the office that evening, Rachel paused. At the wall of photographs showing healthcare workers who had been supported by the Foundation, each face represented a decision to prioritize patient welfare over personal safety, professional advancement, or institutional loyalty. Collectively, they represented a movement toward greater accountability and integrity in American healthcare. The quiet nurse who had started a late-night podcast had become something she never could have imagined, but the values that had motivated her initial decision to speak out remained unchanged. She still believed that patients deserved honesty, transparency, and care that was guided by medical necessity rather than financial opportunity. The Foundation's work was simply a larger platform for expressing those same fundamental principles. Walking out of the office building into the cool evening air, Rachel felt a sense of completion that had been missing during the years of investigation, legal proceedings, and organizational development. The work would continue, but the infrastructure was in place to support it. Healthcare workers across the country knew that they didn't have to face corruption and abuse alone, and patients had advocates who would fight for their rights even when doing so was difficult or dangerous. The transformation from anonymous nurse to national advocate had been costly and challenging, but it had also been deeply meaningful. Rachel had found a way to turn her own painful experience into protection for others, and she had helped create a movement that would outlast any individual case or story. As she walked toward the metro station that would take her home to her quiet apartment in Arlington, Rachel's phone buzzed with a text message from Margaret Foster. "Saw the news about Texas," the message read. "Harold would be proud. We all are." The simple message captured everything that mattered about the Foundation's work. It wasn't about personal recognition or professional advancement. It was about honoring the memory of those who had been harmed by healthcare fraud and protecting those who might be harmed in the future. It was about creating a world where the promise of healthcare to heal, to comfort, to do no harm was more than just words in an oath. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.